At dawn on October 25th, 1944, a handful of American sailors looked out across the sea and saw death coming straight toward them. Battleships 20 times their size, guns that could tear mountains apart, and no chance of rescue. What they did next would leave even the Japanese in stunned disbelief and rewrite naval history forever. It is the dawn of October 25th, 1944. In the sea lanes off the Philippine island of Samar, a great drama of war is about to unfold, one of the most remarkable naval actions in the history of warfare. This is the story of the battle that would become known as the Battle off Samar, itself a critical part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. For months already, the Allies have been pressing toward the liberation of the Philippines. On October 20th, 1944, the American 6th Army landed on the island of Leyte, initiating the campaign to retake the archipelago from the Japanese Empire. Veterans Breakfast Club. The objective was both strategic and symbolic: to sever Japanese control of the region, to cut their supply lines, and fulfill the promise of General Douglas MacArthur, "I shall return," made after the fall of the Philippines in 1942. The Japanese High Command understood the danger. Their plan, codenamed Shogo 1, called for a bold counter-stroke. They would employ multiple fleets to converge on Leyte Gulf, striking the landing forces before the Americans could consolidate their position. One key element: lure away the might of the U.S. Third Fleet northwards with a decoy carrier force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, while the main body, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, would sneak through the San Bernardino Strait and strike the American invasion fleet from the west and south. On the morning of October 25th, Kurita's powerful fleet exited the San Bernardino Strait at about 03 Yo, steaming southwards toward Leyte Gulf. His force was formidable. 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato, the largest and most powerfully armed battleship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Meanwhile, on the American side, the U.S. 7th Fleet's escort carrier groups were providing air support and anti-submarine patrols for the landing forces at Leyte. Among these was Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. These ships were intended for convoy protection and air support, not for combating battleships and cruisers. Their armament and speed were modest compared to the behemoths of the Japanese fleet. In fact, each escort carrier typically carried a modest air group, wildly smaller than a full fleet carrier, and the ships themselves had top speeds of around 18 knots, much slower than the Japanese cruisers and destroyers capable of over 30 knots. Their guns were typically 5-inch, 127mm mid-mounts, ineffective against heavily armored enemy battleships or heavy cruisers. Thus, early on October 25th, the stage was set. A small, lightly armed American task unit would soon face one of the most powerful surface fleets Japan could muster. Retreat was not an option. The American men on Leyte counted on these ships to shield them. The Japanese were determined to smash the invasion before it could succeed. At about 06:37, the situation exploded. An Avenger torpedo bomber pilot from the escort carrier USS St. Lo, one of Taffy 3's carriers, sighted a large force of ships through the morning gloom. He radioed that he saw the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw. Recognizing the unmistakable rising superstructure of Yamato and her companions, Admiral Sprague had suspected something was wrong, but the sheer scale of the Japanese arrival stunned him. The Japanese fleet bore down on Taffy 3 from the west-northwest, already within effective visual and gun range of the carriers and their escorts. The escort carriers turned and began what would become known as the run to the east, a desperate course change to flee into rain squalls and launch aircraft in defense. At the same time, the destroyers and destroyer escorts laid thick smoke screens to mask the carriers, ziggling in the hope of throwing off Japanese fire. And so begins the extraordinary tale. A David versus Goliath struggle of destroyer escorts, torpedoes, aircraft, and courage against the biggest ships ever put to sea. The battle that unfolded after 06:45 on the morning of October 25th, 1944, would become one of the most extraordinary acts of naval defiance ever witnessed. Taffy 3, outnumbered, outgunned, and caught off guard, was about to make its stand. The men aboard these small ships, many barely out of high school, now faced the most powerful surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy could still put to sea. As Admiral Sprague ordered all escort carriers to turn eastward and make full speed, the Japanese guns opened fire. Enormous columns of water erupted around the carriers, shell splashes from 14-inch and even 18.1-inch naval guns. Yamato herself had entered the fight. Her massive shells could travel more than 20 miles and weighed as much as a small car. Against the thinly armored flight decks and unarmored hulls of escort carriers, they would have been catastrophic, yet the U.S. sailors refused to yield. Smoke began billowing from the destroyers USS Hull, USS Herman, and USS Johnston. These were not retreat signals. They were deliberate, thick smoke screens designed to obscure the carriers from Japanese optics. It was a desperate, self-sacrificial act. The destroyers were essentially placing themselves between the Japanese battleships and the carriers, knowing they were inviting fire onto themselves. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the USS Johnston had no hesitation. As soon as the Japanese fleet was sighted, Evans ordered flank speed and turned directly toward the enemy line, alone. His ship accelerated to over 30 knots, cutting through its own smoke, heading for the cruisers and battleships that outmatched his destroyer in every measurable way. The Johnston had only 10 torpedoes, and Evans intended to use them all. As the range closed to about 10,000 yards, Japanese shells began hitting the Johnston. One shell, likely from the heavy cruiser Kumano, hit the forward section with devastating force. Many of Evans's men were killed instantly. Another shell disabled the ship's fire control radar. Smoke filled the decks, but Evans pressed forward. Steering manually from aft steering, after the helm was damaged, the ship maintained course. At 07:12, Johnston launched a spread of torpedoes at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. A moment later, a tremendous explosion tore open Kumano's bow, crippling her and taking her out of the fight. Kumano turned away, trailing smoke and flooding heavily. One small destroyer had just struck a blow against a ship over twice its size. But Johnston was not alone for long. The destroyer USS Hull also charged through the smoke, her crew preparing their own torpedo attack. Hull came under staggering fire as she approached the enemy line. Large caliber shells smashed through her superstructure, disabled her engines, and set fires throughout the ship. Still, the Hull pressed forward, launching torpedoes at the battleship Congo and forcing several Japanese ships to maneuver defensively. Behind them, the USS Herman, the only destroyer in Taffy 3 that still had all its torpedoes, made a bold move. Herman swung out in front of the escort carriers, plunging into the heaviest concentration of Japanese gunfire. At one point, Herman found herself between the battleship Haruna and several heavy cruisers, trading fire with both while laying smoke. Her torpedo attack forced Yamato herself to turn away temporarily. This maneuver delayed the Japanese flagship and bought crucial minutes for the carriers to escape further east. Meanwhile, the carriers of Taffy 3 were launching every aircraft they had. Pilots scrambled to take off, even as enemy shell fire splashed around them. Some launched without full fuel. Others carried no weapons, only machine guns. A few carried nothing but their courage and the understanding that every plane in the air was one more distraction for the Japanese gunners. By 3’s, dozens of wildcats and avengers from both Taffy 3 and the more distant Taffy 2 were circling above the Japanese fleet. They dived again and again, dropping bombs, torpedoes, and in many cases, simply making dry runs to confuse enemy anti-aircraft gunners. A moment of particular bravery came from the carrier USS Gambier Bay. As the only escort carrier within direct firing range of the Japanese heavy cruisers, she became the primary target of their broadsides. Columns of water rose around her as the cruisers Chakuma, Tone, and Chokai closed the distance. Gambier Bay's thin hull and low speed left her no realistic chance to outrun or withstand the assault. At 8:20, Chakuma's shells began landing direct hits. Gambier Bay slowed, listed, and eventually suffered flooding in her engine rooms. She would become the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. But the sacrifice was not in vain. Every minute Gambier Bay bought was another minute for the remaining carriers to escape and for the destroyers to continue their desperate torpedo runs. Back aboard the USS Johnston, Commander Evans found his ship severely damaged. Fires burned uncontrolled. Many of the guns were destroyed or unmanned. Still, Evans turned back into the fight, firing smoke, maneuvering wildly to draw Japanese fire away from the carriers. His crew later recalled that he seemed everywhere at once, on the bridge issuing orders, in the exposed areas directing fire, in damaged compartments helping wounded men. By mid-morning, the sky and sea had become chaotic. Smoke from burning ships mingled with the smokescreens laid by the American destroyers. Aircraft from the escort carriers wheeled overhead in constant attack runs. Japanese shells tore through the air with deafening roars, exploding in towering geysers of water. The clash was so intense that some Japanese commanders believed they were fighting a full American task force with large fleet carriers. The truth was far different. Taffy 3 was fighting for its life. By 09:30, the Japanese had inflicted serious losses on the Americans, but their own formation was disordered. Several heavy cruisers were damaged. One, Chokai, was fatally crippled and would soon be abandoned. Yamato had been forced to turn away earlier and was now attempting to rejoin the action. Confusion and mixed signals hampered Japanese coordination. The Americans were bloodied, but they had achieved what seemed impossible. They had stalled a far superior fleet, and the morning's fiercest fighting was still not over. By late morning on October 25, 1944, the chaotic battle off Samar had reached a fever pitch. The sea was scarred with smoke, drifting oil slicks, and burning fragments of metal. Aircraft wheeled overhead in frantic, overlapping attack runs. And through it all, Taffy 3, the tiny unit that had no business surviving such an encounter, continued to fight with a ferocity that stunned even the Japanese commanders. At around 09:35, the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai, damaged earlier by aerial torpedoes and strafing runs, suffered additional blows from bombs launched by aircraft from USS Kitkun Bay and the nearby Taffy 2 carriers. Flames erupted across her decks. Ammunition stores cooked off. The ship slowed, drifting out of formation. Before long, Chokai became the first major surface combatant of the Japanese force to be fatally crippled in the action. A destroyer would later scuttle her with torpedoes. Another cruiser, Chikuma, was locked in a deadly duel with the battered American forces. Chikuma had relentlessly pursued the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay and was responsible for many of the shells that had torn open her hull. But Chikuma was now under constant aerial attack. Pilots from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2, many flying with little to no ammunition, swarmed the cruiser. They made dry bombing runs, strafing passes, even attempts to distract gunners by diving at steep angles with empty bomb racks. By 10 foam, Chikuma was listing heavily, fires raging below decks. She too would be abandoned, and later scuttled. For the Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the situation was rapidly becoming confusing. Their ships had achieved tactical advantages early in the engagement, sinking the Gambier Bay, crippling the destroyer hull, and severely damaging multiple American vessels. But the violence of the American counterattacks was unexpected. Taffy 3's aircraft appeared to be everywhere, attacking faster and more relentlessly than Kurita had anticipated. Radio reports from his own ships were contradictory. Some reported they were under attack by torpedo bombers. Others insisted they were facing fleet carriers, not escort carriers. One cruiser claimed it was surrounded by multiple enemy task groups. The truth was far more modest, but the illusion created by American smokescreens, repeated torpedo attacks, and constant air assaults had magnified the threat dramatically. Meanwhile, on the American side, the destroyers and destroyer escorts continued acting far beyond their intended capabilities. The heroism of the destroyer escorts. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, one of the destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. At around 8:45 earlier in the fight, she had charged into the fray at flank speed, firing her 5-inch guns so rapidly that her gun crews exceeded peacetime training limits. Her torpedo attack forced the heavy cruiser Chokai to evade and contributed to the damage that ultimately doomed the enemy ship. By 09 Zewaso, Samuel B. Roberts was in a desperate gunnery duel with 3 Japanese cruisers simultaneously. Her crew fired nearly 600 rounds in under 35 minutes, an astonishing feat for such a small warship. But she could not withstand concentrated fire forever. By late morning, she was critically damaged, her hull torn open, her boilers destroyed. At approximately 10:05, after one final salvo, Samuel B. Roberts began to settle by the stern. Her surviving crew later recalled the ship's guns were still warm when she slipped beneath the waves. The USS Hull's final fight. Elsewhere, the destroyer USS Hull was barely afloat. She had been caught repeatedly in the crossfire of battleships and cruisers. Over 40 large-caliber shells struck her during the fight. With her engines failing, her steering shot away, and her decks flooding, Commander Leon S. Kintberger finally ordered the crew to abandon ship. Howell rolled to port and sank shortly after letter 8:55, taking more than half her crew with her. The USS Johnston's last moments. But the most heartbreaking saga was that of the USS Johnston and her commander, Ernest E. Evans. Johnston had already taken severe damage in her first torpedo run. Fires continued to burn along her decks. Her forward guns were destroyed. Yet Evans kept the ship in action for hours, darting in and out of smoke, firing what few rounds he had left, and repeatedly drawing Japanese fire away from the escort carriers. At around 09:20, Johnston emerged from a smoke screen and found herself face to face with 4 Japanese ships, including heavy cruisers. The Japanese opened fire at point-blank range. Shell after shell tore into her hull, ripping away what little remained of the ship's fighting capability. Evans was wounded, but he refused evacuation, still shouting orders and encouragement. By 10:10, Johnston could fight no more. Listing heavily, burning fiercely, she began to lose power. At 10:15, Commander Evans finally ordered "Abandon ship." He was last seen on the fantail, helping wounded crewmen float away on rafts before the ship slipped beneath the waves. Out of 327 men aboard Johnston, only 141 survived. Japanese uncertainty. Despite inflicting grievous losses, Kurita hesitated. The ferocity of American resistance had shaken him. Reports from his cruisers suggested more American ships were appearing from the south. Smoke made it nearly impossible to gauge the true size of the enemy force. U.S. aircraft continued to hammer the Japanese ships relentlessly, even when they had no ordnance left. At around 09:20:09:30, Kurita made his first major withdrawal movement, ordering some of his cruisers to regroup. At 10:20, he made the decisive call. The entire center force would turn north, away from the American landing beaches, away from the crippled escort carriers, and away from the victory Japan desperately needed. The Japanese had broken off the engagement, a moment of unlikely honor. As Taffy 3's ships burned and sank, something extraordinary happened. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, one of the most famous and battle-hardened ships of the Imperial Navy, approached the slow-sinking wreck of the USS Johnston. She came within close range, not to fire, but to offer a solemn salute. Her sailors stood on deck, acknowledging the courage of their opponent. Then she turned away into the smoke. It was a moment of rare chivalry in a war defined by brutality. The impossible outcome, when the guns fell silent. The result seemed impossible on paper. A tiny American escort carrier group had forced back a Japanese battleship cruiser fleet. Yamato and her sisters, some of the most powerful battleships ever built, had retreated from destroyers and aircraft that were barely armed. Taffy 3 had saved the American landing force on Leyte. The human cost was staggering, but the victory was real, and it belonged to the courage of men who refused to run. When the guns finally fell silent off Samar on October 25, 1944, the ocean began to reclaim the dead. Ships that only hours earlier had been at full speed, guns blazing, now drifted helplessly, burning, flooding, sinking. Among them were the brave destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, the USS Johnston, USS Hole, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay. The survivors, scattered across the sea on makeshift rafts, recalled the strange quiet that followed the battle. The smoke had thinned, the thunder of shell fire had ceased, and only the sounds of waves and burning oil remained. Many drifted for hours before rescue arrived. Others disappeared into the deep with their ships. The ocean off Samar is deceptively calm, but beneath that surface lies a plunging abyss. The edge of the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest submarine trenches on Earth. The seafloor here descends sharply into darkness, a precipice that drops thousands of feet into the Hadal Zone, the realm named for Hades, god of the underworld. And it is here, along this watery cliff face, that the wrecks of Taffy 3 came to rest, a battlefield lost to the deep. Finding any wreck in the open ocean is challenging. Finding a shipwreck in the world's deepest trench-adjacent waters is something else entirely. For decades, the final resting place of ships like the Johnston and the Samuel B. Roberts remained unknown. Their exact coordinates lost in the chaos of battle, and the imprecise navigation of 1940s combat conditions. The ocean at these depths, 20,000 feet and more, is pitch black, near freezing, and subject to pressures exceeding 4.5 tons per square inch. No sunlight penetrates. Few creatures live here, and those that do glow faintly with eerie bioluminescence. This was not a place human eyes were meant to see, and for nearly 75 years, no one did. The first breakthrough, RV Petrel, 2019. The first major step towards solving the mystery came in 2019 when the research vessel RV Petrel, funded by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and operated by Vulcan Inc., began scanning the seafloor off Samar. Petrel was equipped with advanced sonar systems designed to map deep terrain and identify anomalies far below the reach of conventional search vessels. In the early phase of scanning, Petrel's team found something extraordinary. What appeared to be the bow section of a warship resting at a depth of approximately 2,400 feet. Subsequent footage confirmed the object was indeed part of the USS Johnston. But the wreck lay deeper than Petrel's remotely operated vehicles could safely descend. They had found the ship, but could not reach it. The world now had proof. One of the deepest shipwrecks in history had been located. But the story was far from over. Enter Victor Vescovo, a descent into history, to find the rest of the Johnston, to see the ship again, to film it, document it, and honor her crew would require the only man on Earth capable of attempting such a dive. Victor Vescovo, former U.S. Navy commander, private equity investor, explorer, and extreme adventurer. Vescovo had recently completed one of the most remarkable achievements in modern exploration, the 5's expedition, during which he piloted his custom-built, submersible DSV limiting factor to the deepest point of each of the world's 5 oceans. The limiting factor had a hull made of 3.5-inch thick titanium and was engineered to survive the crushing pressures of full ocean depth. In 2020, Vescovo turned his attention to the Battle off Samar. He intended to find the Johnston, all of it, the deepest shipwreck ever found, 221. In March 2021, after weeks of scanning and analysis, Vescovo descended into the abyss in the limiting factor. He and sonar expert Jeremy Morizet searched the steep, jagged cliff faces of the Philippine Trench. The submersible's headlights cut through the eternal blackness like twin stars on the second day of dives, at a staggering depth of 21,180 feet, more than 4 miles beneath the surface. The wreck of the USS Johnston came into view. It was the deepest shipwreck ever identified and reached by human explorers at the time. Vescovo's cameras illuminated the scene. The ship rested upright along a sheer undersea slope. Her hull was cracked and punctured by numerous shell hits. The rear third of the ship was missing, torn away by the enormous 18-inch shell from the battleship Yamato. A 6-inch shell hole lay beneath the bridge. Her torpedo racks were empty, silent testimony to her desperate charges that morning. Her 5-inch main guns still pointed to starboard, aimed, even in death, toward the Japanese fleet. It was a haunting, solemn moment. A ship that had fought with impossible bravery now lay entombed in the underworld of the ocean, untouched for nearly 8 decades. Vescovo spent over 8 hours across 2 dives, surveying and documenting the wreck. He later said the experience was deeply emotional, not an adventure, but a pilgrimage. The Hadal Zone, a graveyard like no other. The depths where the Johnston lies belong to the Hadal Pelagic Zone, known simply as the Hadal Zone. Named after Hades, it includes ocean depths from about 19,700 to 36,000 feet. Only a small fraction, less than 2% of the world's ocean floor, falls within this category. Here, darkness is absolute. Temperatures hover near freezing. Pressure exceeds 1/300 atmospheres. Life exists only in forms adapted to extreme conditions. Even the wreck of the Titanic, at 12,500 feet, lies in what scientists would consider mid-depth waters, compared to the crushing gloom where the Johnston now rests. The hunt continues, deeper discoveries. Yet the Johnston would not hold the title of deepest shipwreck for long. In 2022, Vescovo returned to the Philippine Trench, this time to find another of Taffy 3's lost warships, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts. The ship that fought like a battleship. He found her at 22,621 feet, more than 1,400 feet deeper than the Johnston. Samuel B. Roberts now holds the record as the deepest shipwreck ever located. Other ships from the battle, including USS Hull, USS Gambier Bay, and several Japanese vessels, may lie even deeper still, hidden in the abyss, waiting to be found. In the years that followed World War II, the Battle off Samar took on an almost mythic quality. Veterans who survived often spoke of it with a mixture of astonishment and solemn pride. Historians would later call it the most gallant action in naval history. Others simply said that no group of sailors had ever fought harder with so little. It is a battle that should have ended in catastrophe, yet somehow became a miracle, a victory written in sacrifice. The strategic significance of Taffy 3's stand cannot be overstated. Had the Japanese center force smashed through to Leyte Gulf, they would have fallen upon the American troop transports, supply ships, and the tens of thousands of soldiers still coming ashore. The massacre could have reshaped the Pacific War, but because a handful of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts fought like giants, the Japanese force turned back. The American beachhead at Leyte held firm. General MacArthur's return to the Philippines continued as planned, and the Japanese Imperial Navy suffered a psychological blow from which it would never recover. After Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of World War II, the Japanese surface fleet was no longer a meaningful offensive force. Most of its surviving ships either retreated to home waters or remained harbored due to fuel shortages. Never again would Japan field such a powerful armada. The turning point in many ways was the desperate courage shown off Samar. Medal of Honor, Commander Ernest E. Evans. Among the many heroes that day, one name stands tallest. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, captain of the USS Johnston. Evans was a man of quiet intensity, proud of both his Mexican-American and Native American heritage, Creek and Cherokee. At the commissioning ceremony of the Johnston in 1943, he famously told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go into harm's way, and I expect you to do the same." On October 25, 1944, he fulfilled that promise with every fiber of his being. His Medal of Honor citation would later read, "Completely disregarding his own safety, he gallantly directed his ship into battle against overwhelming odds." Evans became the first Native American in U.S. Navy history to receive the Medal of Honor. Most of his crew would receive the Presidential Unit Citation. Many would receive it posthumously. He died as he lived, fighting for every life he could save, the courage of ordinary men. But the heroism of Samar did not belong to Evans alone. The gunners on Samuel B. Roberts, who fired until their barrels overheated, the pilots who launched into the sky with empty bomb racks, determined to make one more attack run, the sailors aboard Gambier Bay, who kept their carrier afloat long enough for others to escape, the crewmen on Hull, Heermann, and Johnston, who charged battleships as if they were equals. Many of these men were barely 19 or 20 years old. They had families waiting for them back home, mothers and fathers who would never know the last thoughts of their sons. Yet in their final hours, they fought with an indomitable spirit that echoed long after the guns fell silent. The Japanese perspective. Respect from the enemy, the courage of Taffy 3, made a deep impression on the Japanese sailors who survived. Decades later, testimonies from officers aboard the cruiser Yahagi and other ships revealed their astonishment at the Americans' aggressiveness. One recalled, "They charged at us like samurai." Another said, "We thought we were fighting several fleets, but it was only one." And then there is the moment that veterans on both sides never forgot. The destroyer Yukikaze, one of the finest ships in the Japanese Navy, approached the sinking Johnston at close range. Not to fire, not to finish the wounded, but to offer a final salute, an acknowledgement of bravery beyond words. In the middle of a brutal war, honor still found a moment to breathe. The ocean as a tomb. As time passed, the battlefield off Samar faded beneath the waves. The men who died remained where they fell, resting inside the shattered hulls of their ships, deep in one of the darkest places on Earth. For decades, the ocean protected their silence. No diver could reach them, no submarine could withstand the pressure. Their graves lay deeper than even the Titanic. Then, nearly 80 years later, technology finally caught up with memory. When Victor Vescovo descended into the abyss and filmed the wreck of the Johnston, her guns still pointing defiantly toward where the enemy once stood, the world was reminded of the battle's raw power. The ocean had kept their secret, but not forever. Why the battle still matters. The story of the Battle off Samar endures not because of its scale, but because of its heart. It is remembered because it was a victory carved from desperation. It proved that courage can overcome impossible odds. It showed that leadership, from Evans, Sprague, Kintberger, Copeland, and others, can inspire men to transcend human limits. And it stands as a reminder that sometimes the smallest force can make the biggest difference. Military academies around the world still study the battle today. Naval officers learn how Taffy 3 used smoke, maneuver, misdirection, and aggressive tactics to confuse and overwhelm a far superior foe. Air Force cadets study the relentless attacks by American pilots, many unarmed, who kept coming until the enemy broke. But beyond strategy and tactics, Samar offers something deeper, a lesson in what people can achieve when there is no one left to fight but themselves. The words that echo through time. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, summarized the battle in a single, unforgettable line. This will go down in history as one of the greatest sea fights of all time. He was right, and history has proven him right again and again. A legacy written on the waves. Today, the names Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay are spoken with reverence by sailors and historians alike. Their wrecks rest in the Hadal depths, where sunlight never reaches, but their story shines brightly across generations. The Battle off Samar reminds us that heroism is not measured by the size of the ship, the weight of its guns, or the strength of its armor. It is measured by the courage of the people who stand their ground when everything says they should run. And on October 25th, 1944, a small group of Americans, teenagers, farm boys, mechanics, pilots, cooks, and captains, stood between a desperate enemy and the thousands of soldiers depending on them. They did not break. They did not yield. They held the line. Their legacy lives in the deep, and in every telling of their impossible, unforgettable stand.